Hugh Thompson was born in Coleraine, County Derry in the north of Ireland in 1860, the oldest of 3 children. He left school at 14 years old and was apprenticed to a linen manufacturing company, but he was far more interested in drawing. As luck would have it, when he was 16, a man named John Vinicum, who managed the art department of a Belfast printing house, saw some of Thompson's work, and he offered him a job at the company's studio. So he moved to Belfast, where Vinicum taught him the basics of commercial illustration and the print process. But after a few years of this, Thompson became increasingly frustrated by his persistently low income and the mundane nature of the work. So in 1883 he sailed for London in the hope of greater opportunities. Once he'd found lodgings in the city, he set about showing his portfolio of drawings to as many publishers as he could find, but met with a wall of indifference and came very close to giving up. But after 3 months of struggle, he managed to get a full-time job with the English Illustrated magazine. By late 1884 he felt financially stable enough to marry, and his fiancée left Ireland to join him in London, where they set up home together. Although the terms of his contract with the magazine were supposedly exclusive, this wasn't rigidly imposed, and one of his most significant early successes was with Days of Sir Roger de Coverley, which was serialised in the Spectator magazine, and it was popular enough to be published in book form not much later. Significantly, these images were reproduced by the Zinco photographic process, which had been pioneered by Spanish illustrator Daniel Vierge in 1882, which bypassed the need for engraving. And the reproduction of Thompson's fine pen drawings benefited considerably from this technological advance. By 1888, his original terms of employment at the English Illustrated magazine had been scrapped altogether, and he was frequently taking commissions from elsewhere. In that year, another 50 of his drawings were published in the book Coaching Days and Coaching Ways by W. O. Tristram, a shared commission with fellow illustrator Herbert Railton. The first published evidence of Thompson's work in colour appeared in the Graphic magazine in 1889 and was printed using chromolithography. The addition of colour to his light comedic images for the loves and jealousies of 2 jolly postboys constituted a significant development, which gave a taste of better printed examples to come later. In the late 1880s he was commissioned to illustrate Oliver Goldsmith's novel The Vicar of Wakefield. It took him 18 months to complete 120 illustrations, although he was still producing magazine illustrations simultaneously. The book was published in 1890 and it had to be reprinted several times to meet the demand. In 1892 he collaborated with the writer Austin Dobson for the first time with The Ballad of Beau Brocade, a collection of 18th century themed poems, and the success of this book would lead to several more later in his career. But even more enduringly popular was Thompson's 1892 illustrated edition of Cranford, written by Elizabeth Gaskell in 1853. Apparently Thompson thought his work for this book wasn't up to the same standard as the illustrations he had earlier created for The Vicar of Wakefield, but the public evidently disagreed and proceeded to buy the book in very large numbers, making it very financially rewarding. Given the nature of the vast majority of his commissions, he had to be particularly attentive to period details, and he was considered to be extremely accurate in his depictions. Whether he had his own collection of costumes and props, as others were known to do, or he referenced books and museums isn't recorded. One of the more remarkable aspects of Thompson's work was his ability to capture the anatomy and movement of both humans and animals, especially as he rarely used life models and worked instead from his own observational rough sketches. In 1893 he illustrated the libretto for an operatic version of The Story of the Pied Piper, composed by Robert Buchanan. This was a particularly lively collection of pen and ink drawings, and his first venture into what might be considered fantasy or fairy tale illustration. And although the page illustrations were black and white only, there was a very attractive watercolour frontispiece too. He had also been offered a commission to illustrate an edition of Jane Austen's novel Pride and Prejudice, which was published in 1894. This appears to have initially contained exclusively monochrome illustrations, although I found a couple of colour versions which I'm fairly sure were published in later editions, and by the rather basic look of them probably not by Thomson himself. He was astonishingly prolific in this period, and in the same year he published another book of verse with Austin Dobson titled Corydon's Song. But it was also in 1894 that his father died, and deeply distressed by the loss, Thomson fell ill himself and was unable to work for months. Nevertheless, following these personal setbacks, he worked again with Dobson on another collection titled The Story of Rosina and Other Verses, which was published in 1895 with a collection of suitably romantic, finely rendered drawings. And in 1896 he returned to the writing of Jane Austen with yet more vignetted pen and ink drawings for new editions of Sense and Sensibility and Emma, both of which continued his unprecedented run of popular success. By this point he was earning a very large income from the late Victorian public's apparently boundless appetite for nostalgia. And alongside the royalty payments he continued to receive, his originals were also being bought eagerly by collectors not just in Britain but also in continental Europe and the USA. In a demonstration of unstoppable creative productivity few could even hope to come close to, in 1897 no less than 3 more Jane Austen novels, Mansfield Park, Persuasion and Northanger Abbey, were published, with illustrations by Thomson, and all sold every bit as well as his earlier work for this author. As the end of the 19th century grew closer, his work began to be reproduced more frequently in full colour in some British magazines and annuals. And in 1898 Thomson's Jack the Giant Killer was published with full colour line and wash illustrations throughout. It was intended to be the first in a series of fairy tales, and all the illustrations he created were possessed of considerably more energy and sense of animation than his more genteel commissions allowed for. And he seems to have engaged with this project with great enthusiasm. But the series never materialised, and whether sales were disappointing or there was some other reason, I haven't been able to find out. But on the evidence of what he produced for this book, it seems a great pity there were no more published. In the same year he began creating illustrated books collectively known as the Highways and Byways series for various locations about Britain and Ireland. And these naturally enough featured many scenic illustrations, most frequently rendered in graphite, of towns and landscapes. There were also telling images of human characters, and on occasion some reprints had colour washes added, which again may or may not have been by Thomson himself. In 1903 he created a colour frontispiece for Little Dumb Castle and Other Stories by Mabel Harriet Spielman, although the actual page illustrations were by others. Which was probably as well, given that it was also that year he illustrated 2 more works of fiction. Tales from Maria Edgeworth was a collection of Irish-themed tales originally written in 1825, which saw a return to the romantic period fiction he had become so inextricably linked with. And the same was equally true of his illustrations for the novel Evelina, written by Fanny Burney in 1788. 1904 saw the publication of Thomson's edition of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which took him about as far back in historical terms as he ever ventured. The collection of medievally themed images he produced, all of which were monochrome only, portrayed both the actual pilgrim characters and scenes from the various stories they told. 1905's The History of Henry Esmond by William Makepeace Thackeray was yet another project which clearly played to his strengths, with the depiction of late Georgian and early Victorian society. But in the same year he also created a series of humorous and fairly uncharacteristic contemporary scenes of a French casino printed in both colour and monochrome. He ventured into less frivolous territory in 1907 for the book Silas Marner, originally written by George Eliot half a century earlier. It contained a collection of suitably downbeat pen and colour wash images using a restrained colour palette which reflected the more serious-minded emotional tone of the narrative, with considerable prowess and visual credibility. In 1910, Thomson enjoyed another of his biggest successes with a collection of Shakespeare's comedies, which boasted many delightfully rendered and well-imagined watercolours depicting scenes from the plays. There were some typically accomplished monochromes used as chapter headings and page titles, but the actual narrative work was all in full colour. And with his usual eye for detail and scene setting, Thomson's evocations of Shakespeare's dramatic works were a particularly absorbing and aesthetically pleasing collection. This was an exceptionally successful project in creative terms, and although like the plays themselves there could be said to be rather a lot of characters simply standing around engaging in dialogue, there were also plenty of more animated and slapstick comedy scenes to balance out the pictorial content. By this point he was actually creating and having his work reproduced in full colour more frequently than in black and white, and in 1911 Thomson's relentless creative energy continued with the play School for Scandal, written by Richard Brinsley Sheridan in 1777. His evocation of an uncanny believable Georgian era, with yet more dainty female characters and dashing young gentlemen, greatly added to the entertainment value of the book. And in 1912 he had similar success with another 18th century comedy of manners, Oliver Goldsmith's She Stoops to Conquer. The same was equally true of the following year's edition of Quality Street, a play by J.M. Barrie, which although set in the same time frame had actually been written in 1901. But Barrie's whimsical dialogue and situations, and of course Thomson's illustrations, gave this light comedic piece considerable period credibility. In 1914 he illustrated another of J.M. Barrie's plays, The Admirable Crichton, which unusually for Thomson was set in a contemporary Edwardian environment. The light humour and social commentary of this piece was ably portrayed by his visualisations of the various characters featuring the play and the contrast of settings between genteel London and life on a tropical island following a shipwreck. In addition to the charm of the full-colour pages, there was also a series of appealingly solid pen and ink monochromes used as chapter and page headings throughout. Unfortunately, during the years of the Great War, publishing in general took an understandable nosedive in Britain and elsewhere in Europe, but he attempted to keep his career going with a couple of propagandist satires which were published in an unknown magazine. During the years of the conflict he was also cursed with more ill health, including a dose of flu and more significant ever-worsening problems. But he had been working on an edition of Tom Brown's School Days by Thomas Hughes, which was published with a collection of typically confident monochromes in 1918. But his rapidly deteriorating health problems finally got the better of him in 1920, and he died at the age of only 60. Despite his failing health, Thomson had worked up to the end of his life and had just managed to complete a set of suitably dramatic and skillfully executed watercolour illustrations for Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, which was published posthumously. And all the images he created for this book were a fitting testament to his rare and enduring abilities. In some cases I can understand how certain illustrators I've featured have not endured the ensuing decades very well. But in the case of Hugh Thomson, I can't begin to imagine why he's not spoken of in the same glowing terms as many of his contemporaries. But as usual, I hope that this video has shone a little light on his remarkable body of work.